I was 8 years old when I first understood that silence could be the loudest sound in the world. The day I found Max, bloodied and trembling in that abandoned construction site. I didn't know that saving him would change everything I thought I knew about communication, love, and what it means to truly understand another living being. The rain was falling harder that October morning, creating rivers of mud that pooled around the concrete barriers where he lay. His golden coat was matted with dirt and something darker, blood that had dried into his fur like cruel paint strokes. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. Those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold every secret the world had ever whispered, staring directly at me with a desperation that transcended any language I'd ever known. Speech balloon, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now? And which city or state are you watching from? My name is Sarah, and I've been deaf since birth. Growing up in a world where everyone around me moved their lips in patterns I couldn't hear, I learned early that communication wasn't just about words floating through the air. It was about watching, feeling, understanding the spaces between gestures and the weight behind someone's gaze. My parents, God bless them, tried everything. Sign language classes, hearing aids that amplified nothing but frustration, speech therapy sessions that left me exhausted and confused. But the truth was, I had found my own way of existing in the world. Through observation, through feeling vibrations in my chest when trucks pass by, through reading the micro-expressions that crossed people's faces when they thought no one was looking. Our small town of Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the grocery store clerk would wave at you from 3 blocks away, and where secrets were harder to keep than promises. But being deaf in a small town meant being simultaneously visible and invisible. People would smile and nod, pat my head with that particular kind of pity that made my stomach turn, and then continue their conversations as if I had simply evaporated. That's why I spent most of my free time exploring the edges of town. The forgotten places where construction projects had been abandoned and nature was slowly reclaiming what humans had left behind. These places spoke to me in a language I understood. The language of forgotten things, of resilience, of quiet beauty that existed without needing to announce itself. The construction site where I found Max had been empty for 2 years. The developers had run out of money halfway through building what was supposed to be a new shopping complex, leaving behind skeletal concrete structures that looked like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. Weeds grew through cracks in the foundation, and graffiti covered the walls with angry colors that seemed to pulse with their own energy. I came there often, especially when the weight of not belonging anywhere else became too heavy to carry. My parents thought I was at the library, where Mrs. Henderson would give me books about animals and faraway places, stories that didn't require me to hear anything to understand everything. But that morning was different. The storm had been building for days, and the air felt electric with tension. I could feel it in my bones, the way the atmosphere seemed to vibrate with unspoken warnings. My mother had tried to keep me inside, her hands moving frantically in sign language, telling me about the weather reports and the danger of flooding. But I was 8, and 8-year-olds don't understand that some storms are too big to weather alone. So I slipped out through the back door while she was distracted by a phone call, pulled on my yellow rain boots, and headed toward the only place that felt like it truly belonged to me. The construction site was transformed by the storm. Water rushed through the half-built channels, creating temporary waterfalls that crashed against concrete with a force I could feel through the soles of my feet. The sound must have been deafening, but for me, it was just another day in my silent world, except for the vibrations that told me nature was putting on a show. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just debris, maybe a bag of construction materials that had been caught in the rushing water. But then I saw the slight movement, the way whatever it was seemed to be fighting against the current rather than flowing with it. I moved closer, my heart beginning to race with that particular kind of fear that comes when you realize you're about to see something you're not prepared for. The rain was coming down so hard that it created a curtain between me and the world. But through that curtain, I could make out the shape of what was clearly an animal. A large dog, German Shepherd by the look of him, was trapped against a concrete barrier. The rushing water had pinned him there, and he was struggling weakly to keep his head above the surface. His fur was plastered against his body, making him look smaller and more vulnerable than he probably was, and there was something wrong with his back leg. It was bent at an angle that made my stomach clench with sympathy. But it was when our eyes met that everything changed. I've heard people talk about moments when time seems to stop, when the world holds its breath and waits for something important to happen. For me, that moment was watching this beautiful, broken creature look directly at me with an expression that said, clearer than any words ever could, "Please don't leave me here to die alone." The water was rising. I could see it creeping higher against the concrete barrier, and I knew that in a few more minutes, this dog would be completely submerged. There was no time to run home and get help. No time to find an adult who might know what to do. There was only me, 8 years old and deaf, standing in a storm that was getting worse by the minute, looking at a creature who needed me more than anyone had ever needed me before. I waded into the water. The current was stronger than I expected and colder. It reached my knees, then my waist, and the force of it threatened to knock me off my feet with every step. But I kept moving toward him, drawn by those eyes that never left mine. By the way he seemed to understand that I was his only chance. When I finally reached him, I could see the full extent of his injuries. His back leg was definitely broken, twisted beneath him in a way that must have been causing incredible pain. There were cuts across his face and neck, probably from debris in the water, and his breathing was labored and shallow. But when I reached out to touch him, something extraordinary happened. He didn't flinch. He didn't growl or snap, or show any of the fear-based aggression that an injured animal might display. Instead, he pressed his head against my hand and looked at me with such profound gratitude that it took my breath away. In that moment, I realized something that would change how I understood the world forever. This dog and I were communicating perfectly, without a single sound passing between us. We were understanding each other in a language that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with need, compassion, and the desperate hope that someone somewhere would care enough to help. I tried to lift him, but he was too heavy and the water was too strong. Every time I got him partially out of the current, it would grab him again and threaten to sweep us both away. I could feel panic starting to build in my chest, that suffocating feeling of being too small and too powerless to make a difference when it mattered most. But then I remembered something my father had taught me about leverage and physics during one of our weekend projects in the garage. If I couldn't lift him directly, maybe I could use the concrete barrier to help. I positioned myself between him and the barrier, using my body to break the current while I worked my hands under his chest and front legs. The water was up to my ribs now, and I could feel how much effort it was taking him just to keep his head above the surface. Stay with me, I thought, hoping somehow that my determination could reach him across the species barrier. Just stay with me a little longer. It took 3 attempts, but finally, I managed to get enough leverage to lift his front half onto a piece of concrete that was higher than the water level. He helped as much as he could, using his good front legs to pull himself up while I pushed from below. Getting his back half out was harder because of the injured leg, but somehow, working together, we managed it. By the time we were both out of the water, we were both exhausted and shaking, him from pain and shock, me from effort and adrenaline. I sat next to him on that concrete slab, both of us soaked and breathing hard, and I realized that I had never felt more connected to another living being in my entire life. Here was this beautiful creature who had been abandoned and hurt, left to die alone in a storm, and yet when I looked at him, I saw nothing but trust and gratitude. He laid his head in my lap, those deep brown eyes never leaving my face, and I felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog anymore. This was about understanding that love and communication existed in forms I had never imagined. That the deepest connections between souls happened in the spaces where words couldn't reach. But we weren't safe yet. The storm was still raging, and I could see that his injuries needed immediate attention. The broken leg was swelling, and there were several deep cuts that were still bleeding. I needed to get him somewhere warm and dry, and I needed to get help from someone who knew more about treating injured animals than an 8-year-old girl. The problem was, I had no way to carry him. He was a large dog, probably weighing close to 80 pounds, and with his injured leg, he couldn't walk on his own. I looked around the construction site, trying to think of some way to transport him, when I remembered the old tarp I had seen tucked under one of the concrete slabs. It was dirty and torn in places, but it was large enough and strong enough to work as a makeshift stretcher. I spread it out next to him and, as gently as I could, helped him move onto it. He whimpered slightly when I had to maneuver his injured leg, but he never tried to bite or resist. It was as if he understood that I was trying to help him, that every movement, no matter how painful, was bringing him closer to safety. Dragging him across the construction site was one of the hardest things I had ever done. The tarp slid over the rough concrete and caught on every piece of debris, and I had to stop frequently to rest and make sure he was still okay. But gradually, inch by inch, we made our way toward the road. The rain was finally starting to ease up, and I could see the first hints of sunlight breaking through the clouds. It felt like a sign, like the universe was acknowledging that we had made it through the worst part, and that things were going to get better from here. When we finally reached the road, I was faced with a new problem. How do you flag down help when you can't yell? When you can't make the kinds of sounds that would get someone's attention? I tried waving my arms, but the few cars that passed by didn't seem to notice us. Or maybe they just didn't want to stop for a muddy little girl and a wounded dog in the aftermath of a storm. I was starting to feel desperate when I saw Mrs. Patterson's blue pickup truck coming down the road. Mrs. Patterson was our neighbor, a woman in her 60s who ran a small farm on the outskirts of town and who had always been kind to me. More importantly, she was one of the few adults who had taken the time to learn some basic sign language so she could communicate with me directly. I stood in the middle of the road and waved my arms frantically, hoping she would see me in time to stop. The truck slowed, then pulled over to the side of the road. Mrs. Patterson got out, took one look at me and the dog, and immediately understood that this was an emergency. Her hands moved quickly in sign language, asking me what had happened and if I was hurt. I signed back as fast as I could, explaining about finding the dog in the construction site and how he was injured and needed help. Mrs. Patterson nodded and went to look at him more closely. When she knelt down next to him, something beautiful happened. The dog, who had been wary of every other human he had encountered, immediately relaxed under her touch. It was as if he could sense that she was another person who understood about caring for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. Mrs. Patterson examined his injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with hurt animals before. She signed to me that we needed to get him to the veterinary clinic in town as quickly as possible. That his leg was definitely broken and some of his cuts were deep enough to need stitches. Together, we carefully lifted him into the back of her truck. Mrs. Patterson had some old blankets in the cab, and we wrapped him in them to keep him warm and to cushion him against the bumps in the road. I climbed into the back with him, holding his head in my lap and stroking his fur while Mrs. Patterson drove as quickly and carefully as she could toward town. During that drive, I watched his face and saw something that made my heart ache with recognition. He was scared, but he was trying to be brave. He was in pain, but he was fighting through it. He was alone in the world, but he was choosing to trust the people who had shown him kindness. In other words, he was just like me. The veterinary clinic was a small building on Main Street, run by Dr. Martinez, a woman who had been taking care of the town's animals for as long as I could remember. When we arrived, she took one look at our patient and immediately went into action. I watched through the window as Dr. Martinez and her assistant worked on him. They gave him something for the pain, cleaned and stitched his wounds, and carefully set his broken leg in a cast. Throughout the entire process, he remained calm and cooperative, as if he understood that these people were trying to help him. Mrs. Patterson stayed with me while we waited, and at some point during those long hours, she asked me a question that I wasn't prepared for. "What are you going to call him?" I had been so focused on getting him to safety that I hadn't thought about what would happen next. But as soon as she asked, I knew exactly what his name should be. "Max," I signed back. "His name is Max." She smiled and nodded, and I could see in her expression that she understood this wasn't just about naming a dog. This was about claiming him, about making him mine in the way that only happens when two souls recognize each other across all the differences that should have kept them apart. When Dr. Martinez finally came out to talk to us, she had good news and complicated news. The good news was that Max was going to be fine. His leg would heal completely, and the cuts, while deep, hadn't damaged anything vital. The complicated news was that he didn't have a microchip. No one had reported him missing, and he showed signs of having been on his own for several weeks. In other words, he was homeless, just like he had been when I found him. Mrs. Patterson looked at me with a question in her eyes, and I knew what she was asking without her having to sign anything. I nodded, and she turned to Dr. Martinez. "We'd like to take him home." The next few weeks were a revelation. Max came to live with us, and it was as if he had always been part of our family. He was gentle with my parents, polite with visitors, and absolutely devoted to me in a way that went beyond typical pet-owner relationships. But the most extraordinary thing was how we communicated. Max seemed to understand that I was different from other humans, that I experienced the world through different senses than most people. And instead of this being a barrier between us, it became the foundation of our connection. He learned to get my attention by gently touching me with his paw rather than barking. He learned to position himself so that I could see his expressions and body language clearly. He learned to respond to my hand signals and to the vibrations I would make by stamping my foot on the floor. But more than that, he seemed to understand my emotional states in a way that no one else ever had. When I was frustrated by my inability to communicate with someone, Max would rest his head on my lap and look at me with those deep brown eyes that said, "I understand you perfectly." When I was sad about feeling left out of conversations, he would bring me his favorite toy and drop it at my feet, as if to say, "Let's play our own game instead." And when I was happy, when I was running through the backyard or reading a book in the sunshine, Max would position himself nearby and simply be present, sharing in my joy without needing to add anything to it. The transformation in both of us was remarkable. Max's physical injuries healed completely, and he grew stronger and more confident every day. His coat became glossy and thick, his eyes bright and alert, and his tail developed a constant wag that seemed to say, "Life is good when you're loved." But the change in me was even more profound. For the first time in my life, I had a companion who didn't see my deafness as something to be fixed or worked around. Max saw it as simply part of who I was, no more significant than the color of my hair or the size of my feet. With Max, I discovered that I wasn't broken or incomplete. I was simply different, and different could be beautiful. My parents were amazed by the bond between us. They had always loved me and tried their best to understand my world, but they had never seen me as confident and happy as I became with Max by my side. He gave me something they couldn't, a relationship based on complete acceptance and understanding. But it was at school where the real magic happened. I had always been the quiet kid who sat in the back of the classroom, the one who needed special accommodations and who other children weren't quite sure how to approach. My teachers were kind, but they often spoke to me in the careful, overly enunciated way that adults use when they're not sure if they're being understood. Everything changed the day I brought Max to school for our show and tell presentation. I had been working on my presentation for weeks, practicing my signs and preparing a poster that showed how Max and I communicated. I was nervous about standing in front of the class, about being the center of attention in a way that highlighted my differences rather than hiding them. But when the moment came, Max walked calmly beside me to the front of the classroom and sat down next to my chair. He looked out at the other children with the same gentle confidence he showed everywhere else, and immediately, I felt some of my nervousness fade away. I began my presentation, using sign language while my teacher, Mrs. Johnson, spoke my words aloud for the class. I explained how Max and I had met, how we had learned to communicate, and how our friendship had taught me that there are many different ways to understand each other. But the most powerful part of the presentation was the demonstration. I asked Max to sit, and he did. I asked him to lie down, and he did. I asked him to shake hands, and he offered his paw to Mrs. Johnson. But then I did something that made the entire classroom go silent. I covered my eyes with my hands, blocking my vision completely. Then I made a series of hand signals that Max couldn't see, followed by a specific pattern of foot stamps on the floor. Max immediately responded, moving to my left side and gently taking my hand in his mouth to guide me. I opened my eyes and looked at my classmates. For the first time since I had started school, I saw something in their faces that I had never seen before. Not pity, not confusion, but genuine admiration. One of the boys, Tommy, raised his hand and asked, "How did he know what you wanted him to do if he couldn't see your hands?" I smiled and signed my answer while Mrs. Johnson translated. He felt the vibrations from my feet through the floor, and he knows that specific pattern means "come help me." We've been practicing together, and he's learned to understand my signals in lots of different ways. Another girl, Sarah, asked, "Can you teach us some of the signs you use with Max?" And for the next 20 minutes, I found myself teaching my classmates basic hand signals, showing them how Max responded to different gestures and movements. They were fascinated, asking questions and wanting to try the signals themselves. By the end of the presentation, something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my classmates. Instead of being the girl who was different and difficult to understand, I had become the girl who knew something special, who had a unique skill that others wanted to learn. Max had given me more than companionship. He had given me confidence, pride in who I was, and a way to share my world with others instead of feeling locked out of theirs. The months that followed were some of the happiest of my childhood. Max and I were inseparable, going everywhere together and continuing to develop our unique form of communication. He learned dozens of hand signals, responding to everything from basic commands to complex requests. But more than that, he learned to read my moods and emotions with uncanny accuracy. When I was having a difficult day at school, he would be waiting at the door when I got home, ready with his favorite game or a gentle nuzzle that said, "I'm here, and everything is going to be okay." When I was excited about something, he would match my energy, bouncing around the yard and bringing me stick after stick to throw. When I was concentrating on homework, he would lie quietly beside my desk, close enough that I could reach out and touch him if I needed the comfort of his presence. And when I was sad, which still happened sometimes when the weight of being different felt too heavy to carry, Max would simply be there. He would rest his head on my lap and look at me with those deep brown eyes that held all the love and understanding in the world. And I would remember that I was never truly alone. The turning point came almost a year after I had found Max, on a day that started like any other, but ended with a moment that would change everything. I was in the backyard with Max, practicing some new signals I had been teaching him, when I heard something that made me freeze in place. It was a sound, but not the kind of sound I was used to experiencing. This wasn't the vibration of a truck passing by, or the feeling of music through the floorboards. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to come from inside my own head. I looked at Max, confused and a little frightened, and saw that he was staring at me with an expression of intense concentration. His mouth was moving, and I realized with a shock that the sound I was hearing was somehow connected to him. Then it happened again, clearer this time, and I understood with a jolt of recognition that what I was hearing was Max's bark. But that was impossible. I had been deaf since birth. I had never heard a sound in my entire life. The doctors had been very clear that my hearing loss was complete and permanent, that no amount of therapy or technology would ever change that. Yet there I was, standing in my backyard on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, hearing my dog bark for the first time. I must have looked terrified, because Max immediately came over to me and pressed his body against my legs, offering comfort and reassurance in the way he always did when I was upset. But this time, his presence had an added dimension. I could feel the rumble of his breathing, but I could also hear it, a soft, rhythmic sound that was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. I ran into the house to find my parents, Max close behind me, and tried to explain what was happening. My mother's face went white when I told her, and she immediately called Dr. Martinez to ask if there was any medical reason why my hearing might suddenly start working. Dr. Martinez recommended that we see a hearing specialist immediately, and within hours, I was sitting in a doctor's office, wearing headphones and listening to beeps and tones that I had never known existed. The audiologist, Dr. Thompson, was a kind woman who had been recommended by our family doctor. She had gentle hands and patient eyes, the kind of person who understood that medical miracles were sometimes wrapped in the most ordinary moments. She ran test after test, each one more complex than the last, and with each test, her expression grew more puzzled and amazed. I remember sitting in that sterile room, with its white walls and the smell of disinfectant that seemed to coat everything, watching Dr. Thompson's face as she studied the results. My parents sat beside me, my mother's hands trembling slightly as she signed questions that Dr. Thompson couldn't understand, my father's face a mixture of hope and disbelief. The hearing booth was a strange place, like being inside a bubble where the outside world couldn't reach. But for the first time in my life, sounds were reaching me from inside that bubble. Beeps and tones and whistles that painted patterns in my mind like colors I had never seen before. Dr. Thompson would play a sound, and I would raise my hand when I heard it. Each time I responded, her eyes would widen a little more, and she would make notes on her clipboard with increasing urgency. After what felt like hours, she finally removed the headphones and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a doctor's face before. It was wonder, pure, unfiltered wonder. Finally, she called my parents into the room and explained something that none of us had ever heard of before. Her voice was careful and measured, but I could see the excitement barely contained beneath her professional demeanor. Sometimes, she said, in very rare cases, people who had been born with certain types of hearing loss could experience sudden, unexplained recovery of their hearing. The medical term was sudden sensory neural hearing loss reversal, and it happened so infrequently that most doctors never saw a case in their entire careers. She pulled out medical journals and showed us case studies, pointing to charts and graphs that meant nothing to me, but everything to my parents. There were stories of children and adults who had lived their entire lives in silence, only to wake up one day in a world full of sound. The cases were so rare that they were studied extensively, but none of the research could explain exactly why it happened. But the most interesting part of what Dr. Thompson told us was that this type of hearing recovery was often triggered by intense emotional experiences or deep psychological connections. The brain, she explained, was capable of forming new neural pathways under extraordinary circumstances, and sometimes those pathways could restore functions that had been dormant since birth. She told us about a woman in Japan who regained her hearing after the birth of her first child, About a man in Germany whose hearing returned after surviving a car accident that killed his best friend. About a teenager in Australia who started hearing the day her beloved grandmother passed away. In each case, the doctor said, there had been an emotional trauma or connection so powerful that it literally rewired the brain, creating new pathways where none had existed before. In other words, my love for Max and his love for me had somehow awakened a part of my brain that had been sleeping for 8 years. Dr. Thompson spent another hour explaining the technical aspects of what was happening to me. She used words like neuroplasticity and synaptic reorganization, terms that sounded like magic spells to my 8-year-old ears. But the simple truth was this: my brain had found a way to hear because my heart had found something worth listening to. She warned us that this type of recovery was unpredictable. Some people experienced full hearing restoration, while others gained only partial hearing. Some people maintained their new abilities permanently, while others saw them fade over time. There was no way to predict what would happen in my case, no roadmap to follow or treatment plan to implement. All we could do was wait and see, and hope that whatever miracle had begun would continue to unfold. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment and discovery that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. Suddenly, I was living in a universe full of sounds I had never imagined, each one a revelation that left me breathless with wonder and sometimes overwhelmed with sensory overload. The first morning I woke up and could hear birds singing outside my window, I thought I was still dreaming. The sound was so beautiful, so pure and joyful, that I started crying before I was even fully awake. My mother found me sitting up in bed with tears streaming down my face, and when she asked what was wrong, I could only point toward the window and try to explain the magic that was happening outside. She sat with me for an hour that morning, naming every sound we heard together: the chirping of robins, the distant hum of traffic, the whistle of the kettle downstairs as my father made his morning coffee. Each sound was like a gift being unwrapped, a secret that the world had been keeping from me for 8 years. But learning to live with hearing was harder than I had expected. Sounds that other people had grown up with and learned to filter out were overwhelming to me. The refrigerator hummed constantly, creating a background noise that made me feel anxious. The clock in the hallway ticked with a rhythm that seemed to echo inside my skull. Even the sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood floors was startling and strange. Dr. Thompson had warned us about this. She called it auditory hypersensitivity, and she explained that my brain was working overtime to process all the new information it was receiving. She recommended that we introduce sounds gradually, starting with quiet environments and slowly building up my tolerance for busier, noisier places. Max seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in me. In the days following my hearing breakthrough, he became even more attentive than usual, watching my reactions to different sounds and somehow knowing when I was becoming overwhelmed. When the neighbor's lawn mower started up one afternoon and sent me into a panic, Max immediately pressed his body against my legs and guided me to the quiet of my bedroom, where we sat together until the noise stopped. But the most wonderful sound of all was Max's voice, and discovering the full range of his communication was like learning a new language that I had been speaking fluently without knowing it. He had a rich, warm bark that he used to greet me when I came home from school, a sound that seemed to carry all the joy and excitement of a reunion between old friends. He had a softer, more questioning sound that he made when he wanted something, a gentle woof that rose at the end like a question mark. He had a playful yip that he used during our games, quick and bright like laughter. And he had a gentle whine that he made when he was concerned about something, a sound so full of empathy that it made my heart ache. For the first time, I could hear him talking to me, and I realized that he had been talking to me all along. All those months when I thought we were communicating through sight and touch alone, he had been adding his voice to our conversations, trusting that somehow, someway, I would eventually be able to hear him. I spent hours during those first weeks just listening to Max, learning the nuances of his vocal expressions and understanding how much I had been missing. When he was happy, his barks had a musical quality, almost like he was singing. When he was alerting me to something important, his voice became deeper and more urgent. When he was being playful, he would string together a series of short barks that sounded almost like laughter. But perhaps the most amazing discovery was that Max had apparently been trying to mimic human speech patterns. Sometimes, when he was particularly excited or when he wanted my attention, he would make sounds that rose and fell like sentences, complete with pauses and inflections that suggested meaning beyond simple dog communication. Dr. Thompson was fascinated when I told her about this during one of our follow-up appointments. She explained that dogs were capable of much more sophisticated vocal communication than most people realized, and that Max had probably been developing these complex vocalizations specifically for me, trying to bridge the gap between his world and mine in the only way he knew how. The thought that Max had been working so hard to communicate with me, even when he thought I couldn't hear him, filled me with such overwhelming love and gratitude that I had to excuse myself from the appointment to go cry in the bathroom. My relationship with my parents also began to change in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, I could hear their voices when they talked to each other, and I discovered that they had entire conversations about me that I had never known about. I heard my mother crying one night, telling my father how guilty she felt that she hadn't been able to give me the help I needed, how she worried that she had failed me as a mother. I heard my father reassuring her, telling her that she had done everything possible and that what mattered was that I was healthy and happy and loved. These conversations were sometimes hard to listen to, but they also gave me a deeper understanding of how much my parents had struggled with my deafness, how much they had worried about my future, and whether I would be able to live a full and independent life. But they also revealed something beautiful. How proud they were of me, how amazed they were by my resilience and adaptability, and how much they had learned from watching me navigate the world in my own unique way. My father, who had always been a man of few words, turned out to have a gentle, melodic voice that he used when he thought no one was listening. I would hear him talking to Max in the backyard, telling him stories about his day at work or asking him to take good care of me while they were gone. My mother's voice was different than I had imagined. In sign language, her hands moved with sharp precision and clear intent. But her spoken voice was softer, more musical, with little laughs and sighs that revealed emotions she kept hidden in her hand movements. Hearing my parents' voices for the first time was like meeting them all over again, understanding new dimensions of their personalities that had been invisible to me before. But perhaps the most profound change was in how I began to understand music. My parents had always tried to share music with me by letting me feel the vibrations through speakers, or by watching music videos where I could see the performers moving to rhythms I couldn't hear. But actually hearing music for the first time was like discovering a new dimension of reality. The first song I ever truly heard was Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which my mother played for me on an old record player that had belonged to my grandmother. As Judy Garland's voice filled the room, I understood for the first time why people talked about music with such passion and reverence. It wasn't just sound, it was emotion made audible, hope and longing and dreams all woven together into something that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the soul. I sat on the living room floor with Max beside me, both of us completely still, as that beautiful voice painted pictures in the air around us. When the song ended, I looked at my parents and saw that they were both crying. My mother signed to me, asking what I thought, but I couldn't find words in any language to describe what I had just experienced. Music became an obsession for me during those early weeks of hearing. I wanted to hear everything: classical symphonies, folk songs, rock and roll, jazz, country music. Each genre was like exploring a different country, with its own customs and language and emotional landscape. Max seemed to have opinions about music too. He would perk up during certain songs, his tail wagging in rhythm with the beat. Other songs would make him restless or cause him to leave the room entirely. He had a particular fondness for acoustic guitar and piano music, and he would often fall asleep during classical concerts on the radio. I started to wonder if Max had been hearing music all along and missing it, the way I had been missing so many conversations and sounds. Maybe music was another language we had been sharing without knowing it, another way we had been connected across the species divide. School became a completely different experience once I could hear. Suddenly, I was privy to all the side conversations, the whispered jokes, the spontaneous discussions that happened when the teachers stepped out of the room. For the first time, I understood why my classmates sometimes burst into laughter for no apparent reason. There had been sounds and comments that I simply hadn't been able to access. But school also became more challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The constant noise of 30 children in one room was overwhelming at times. The scraping of chairs, the rustling of papers, the tapping of pencils. All of these sounds that my classmates had learned to tune out were distracting and sometimes painful for my newly awakened ears. My teacher, Mrs. Johnson, was incredibly patient and understanding. She worked with me to find strategies for managing the sensory overload, including giving me permission to wear soft earplugs during particularly noisy activities and allowing me to take breaks in the library when I needed quiet. But the most wonderful part of being able to hear at school was discovering that my classmates had been talking about me and Max all along. I learned that Tommy had been telling everyone about how smart Max was, and how he wanted to teach his own dog the hand signals I had shown them. I learned that Sarah had been practicing sign language at home, so she could communicate with me better. I learned that my classmates didn't see me as weird or broken or pitiable. They saw me as interesting, as someone who knew things they didn't know and who had experiences they couldn't imagine. This revelation changed everything about how I saw myself and my place in the world. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned during those first months of hearing was that sound, wonderful as it was, didn't fundamentally change who I was or what I was capable of. I was still the same person who had learned to navigate the world through observation and intuition. I was still the same person who had saved Max from that storm, and who had learned to communicate with him in ways that transcended traditional language. Hearing was an addition to my life, not a correction of a defect. It was another tool in my communication toolkit, another way to experience the world. But it didn't make me more complete or more valuable as a person. This understanding was crucial, because there were days when my hearing fluctuated or when certain sounds disappeared entirely. Dr. Thompson had warned us that this type of recovery was often unstable, especially in the early stages, and that I might experience periods where my hearing would come and go. On those days when the sounds would fade, and I would find myself back in the familiar silence of my childhood, I discovered that I wasn't afraid or devastated. I was still me, still capable of communication and connection and love. Max was still Max, still devoted and understanding and present. The hearing was a gift, but it wasn't the source of my worth or my happiness. That came from the relationships I had built, the love I had given and received, and the understanding that connection could happen in countless different ways. Winter came early that year, and with it came new sounds that I had never experienced before. The whisper of snowflakes against the window, the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, the distant scraping of snow plows in the early morning hours. Max loved the snow, and I loved watching him discover it through my newly awakened senses. I could hear the joy in his breathing as he bounded through the drifts in our backyard, the soft thud of his paws on the snow-covered ground, the way his tail would create a whooshing sound as it cut through the air. But winter also brought challenges that I hadn't anticipated. Cold weather seemed to affect my hearing in unpredictable ways. Some days, Sounds would be crystal clear and sharp. Other days, everything would sound muffled and distant, as if I were listening from underwater. Dr. Thompson explained that this was normal. That cold weather could affect the tiny bones and membranes in the ear, especially in someone whose hearing was still stabilizing. She assured us that these fluctuations didn't mean my hearing was deteriorating permanently, just that my ears were still learning how to function properly. Max seemed to sense these changes in my hearing before I did. On days when my hearing was diminished, he would position himself closer to me, making sure I could see his body language and facial expressions clearly. On days when my hearing was particularly acute, he would be more vocal, as if he knew I could appreciate the full range of his communication. It was during one of these crystal-clear hearing days in late December that I experienced something that still takes my breath away when I think about it. I was sitting by the fireplace with Max, reading a book while he dozed beside me. The house was quiet, my parents having gone to bed early, and the only sounds were the gentle crackling of the fire and the soft rhythm of Max's breathing. Suddenly, Max's breathing changed. It became deeper, more rhythmic, and then I heard something that made me set down my book and listen with every fiber of my being. Max was dreaming, and he was making sounds in his sleep. Soft whimpers and gentle barks, but also something else, something that sounded almost like words. I leaned closer, hardly daring to breathe, and listened to the soft murmurings coming from my sleeping friend. And I swear, with every bit of honesty in my heart, that I heard him say my name. It was soft and slurred, the way words sound when spoken in sleep, but it was unmistakably Sarah. He said it twice, followed by a contented sigh, and then settled back into peaceful silence. I sat there for the rest of the night, watching him sleep and thinking about what I had heard. I knew that most people would say I had imagined it, that dogs couldn't actually speak human words. But I also knew what I had heard, and I understood that the bond between Max and me had transcended every boundary that should have separated us. He wasn't just dreaming about me. He was dreaming in my language, trying to reach me even in sleep through the medium that had become so precious to both of us. The next morning, I didn't tell my parents what I had heard. Some experiences are too sacred to share, too perfect to risk having them explained away or diminished by skepticism. But I carried that moment with me like a secret treasure, a reminder that love could work miracles that science couldn't measure or explain. Spring arrived with an explosion of sounds that I could never have imagined. The return of migrating birds brought symphonies of song that seemed to go on from dawn until dusk. The melting snow created tiny waterfalls and streams that bubbled and gurgled with liquid music. The first thunderstorms of the season brought the deep rumble of thunder that I could feel in my chest as well as hear with my ears. Max and I spent hours exploring these new auditory landscapes. He would alert me to sounds I might have missed: the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of a squirrel in the bushes, the musical tinkle of wind chimes from a neighbor's porch. It was as if he had appointed himself my guide to the world of sound, helping me navigate this new territory with the same patience and dedication he had shown when helping me navigate the world of silence. By the time my 9th birthday arrived in May, my hearing had stabilized into what Dr. Thompson described as remarkable recovery with excellent prognosis. The formal medical language didn't capture the miracle of what had happened, but it meant that I could expect to keep this gift that Max had helped to awaken in me. My birthday party that year was unlike any I had ever experienced before. For the first time, I could hear my friends singing happy birthday, their voices creating harmonies that made me laugh and cry at the same time. I could hear the rustle of wrapping paper, the pops and squeaks of balloons, the delighted squeals when Max performed his tricks for the assembled crowd. But the most meaningful moment came when my parents presented me with a special gift they had been working on for months. It was a scrapbook filled with photos and mementos from the past year. But what made it special was that they had recorded their voices telling the story of each picture. Page by page, I could listen to their narration of our journey together. Finding Max in the storm, nursing him back to health, watching our bond develop, witnessing my hearing return. Their voices were full of love and pride and wonder, and as I turned each page, I understood more deeply how much this experience had changed all of us. The final page of the scrapbook contained a letter they had written to me, but instead of printing it out, they had recorded themselves reading it aloud. Their message was simple but profound. They told me how proud they were of the person I had become, how much they had learned from watching me navigate challenges with grace and creativity, and how grateful they were that Max had come into our lives and shown us all new ways to understand love and communication. As summer approached and school ended, I reflected on how much my world had expanded in the past year. I had gained the ability to hear, but more importantly, I had gained confidence in myself and pride in who I was. I had learned that differences weren't deficits to be overcome, but unique perspectives that could enrich the world in unexpected ways. Max and I continued to develop our special form of communication, incorporating sounds now that I could hear them, but never abandoning the visual and tactile cues that had been the foundation of our relationship. We had created something entirely our own, a hybrid language that combined the best of both our worlds. But perhaps the most important thing I had learned was that the miracle hadn't been my hearing returning. The miracle had been finding Max in the first place, recognizing the love and loyalty and wisdom that lived behind those deep brown eyes, and choosing to trust in a connection that transcended every logical reason why it shouldn't have worked. The doctors couldn't explain exactly how or why my hearing had returned, but they didn't need to. I knew the answer. Max had loved me so completely, so unconditionally, that he had somehow called my ears back to life. But even more than that, he had taught me that communication was about so much more than just words or sounds. He had shown me that love could transcend any barrier, that understanding could happen without language, and that the deepest connections between souls happened in the spaces where words and sounds couldn't reach. My hearing continued to improve over the following months, but I never forgot the lessons I had learned during my silent years. The world of sound was magnificent and overwhelming, but it was also just one layer of a much more complex reality that I had learned to navigate with all my senses. I continued to use sign language, both with Max and with other people, because I had learned that there was beauty and clarity in communication that didn't depend on sound. My hands still moved when I was thinking deeply, still shaped words in the air when I was trying to work through complex emotions. Sign language had become part of who I was, not something to be abandoned now that I could hear. Max seemed to understand this instinctively. Even though I could now hear his barks and whimpers, he continued to use the body language and visual cues we had developed together. When he wanted to go outside, he would still come to me and perform the specific sequence of movements we had established, sitting by the door, then walking to me, then returning to the door. When he was worried about something, he would still position himself so that I could see his face clearly, his expressions as eloquent as any words. We had created something unique together, a communication system that drew from multiple languages and sensory experiences. It was richer and more nuanced than either sound or sight alone could have provided, and I began to understand that this was what true intimacy looked like. Two beings so attuned to each other that they could communicate across any barrier. The changes in my relationship with the world were profound and sometimes unexpected. I discovered that I had been lip-reading far more accurately than anyone had realized, including myself. When I could finally hear people's voices, I found that the words I was hearing matched perfectly with the mouth movements I had been interpreting for years. This revelation amazed my parents and teachers, who began to understand that my silent years hadn't been years of isolation or limitation. They had been years of developing incredibly sophisticated skills of observation and interpretation that most hearing people never needed to acquire. I could read micro-expressions with uncanny accuracy. I could sense mood changes in people before they spoke a word. I could detect lies and discomfort and joy in ways that seemed almost telepathic to others, but felt perfectly natural to me. These skills didn't disappear when I gained hearing. If anything, they became more refined. I now had access to tone of voice and vocal inflection as additional data points, which made my understanding of human communication even more sophisticated. Max and I became something of a local phenomenon. Word spread through our small town about the deaf girl who had rescued a dog and then mysteriously regained her hearing. People would stop my parents at the grocery store or at church to ask about our story, to share their own stories of beloved pets, or simply to marvel at what they perceived as a miracle. Dr. Martinez invited us to speak at a regional veterinary conference about the human-animal bond and its potential therapeutic effects. Standing in front of a room full of veterinarians and animal behaviorists, with Max calm and dignified beside me, I tried to explain what our relationship had taught me about communication, love, and healing. I told them that Max had never seen my deafness as a limitation to be overcome. To him, it was simply part of who I was, no more significant than the color of my eyes or the length of my hair. This acceptance had allowed us to develop forms of communication that went far beyond the traditional boundaries between human and animal interaction. I explained how Max had learned to respond not just to hand signals, but to changes in my posture, my breathing patterns, even the electrical energy that seemed to shift around me when my emotions changed. In return, I had learned to read his body language with such precision that I could often predict his needs and reactions before he expressed them. The veterinarians were fascinated by our story, but what struck me most during that presentation was the realization that Max and I weren't unique in our ability to communicate across species lines. Many of the people in that room shared similar stories of profound connections with animals, relationships that transcended traditional understanding of what was possible between humans and their pets. After the conference, a researcher from the university contacted my parents about participating in a study on human-animal communication and its potential neurological effects. Dr. Sarah Chun was a neuroscientist who specialized in studying how emotional bonds could influence brain development and function. The study involved a series of brain scans and cognitive tests, both with and without Max present. Dr. Chun wanted to see if there were measurable differences in my brain activity when I was interacting with Max compared to when I was alone or with other people. The results were extraordinary. The scans showed that when Max and I were together, certain areas of my brain became hyperactive, regions associated with empathy, nonverbal communication, and emotional processing. But even more interesting was the discovery that these same brain regions showed permanent changes, new neural pathways that hadn't existed before my relationship with Max began. Dr. Chun explained that this provided scientific evidence for something I had always known intuitively. My bond with Max had literally rewired my brain, creating new capacities for communication and emotional connection that extended far beyond our relationship. These findings were published in a respected neuroscience journal, making Max and me inadvertent contributors to the scientific understanding of human-animal bonds. But for me, the most meaningful aspect of the research wasn't the validation it provided for our story. It was the hope it offered to other children and adults who felt isolated or different. Proof that connection and communication could happen in ways that science was only beginning to understand. As my 9th birthday approached, I began to reflect on the year that had changed everything. 12 months earlier, I had been a lonely little girl who felt like she lived in a separate world from everyone around her. Now I was part of a family that included not just my parents, but Max, and through him, a broader community of people who understood that love could take forms that defied conventional explanation. My birthday party that year was a celebration not just of another year of life, but of the journey we had all taken together. My classmates came, of course, but so did Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Martinez, Dr. Thompson, and even Dr. Chun, who had become something of a friend to our family. Max was the star of the party, performing all his tricks and accepting admiration from the assembled crowd with the dignity of a celebrity. But what touched me most was watching how naturally he interacted with each person, seeming to sense their individual personalities and needs. He was gentle and calm with my younger cousin, who was afraid of dogs. He was playful and energetic with my classmates who wanted to play fetch. He was respectful and well-behaved with the adults who wanted to pet him and hear his story. It was as if he understood that he represented something important. Proof that love and understanding could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle, heal any wound. He carried that responsibility with grace and dignity, never showing off or demanding attention, but simply being present and available to anyone who needed to experience the kind of unconditional acceptance he had shown me. During the party, my mother pulled me aside and handed me a special gift that she and my father had been working on for months. It was a leather-bound journal, handcrafted by a local artisan, with Max's paw print embossed on the cover. "We want you to write down your story," she signed, her eyes bright with tears. "All of it. How you found Max, how you learned to communicate, how your hearing came back. Someday, when you're older, you might want to share this story with the world." I held the journal in my hands, feeling the smooth leather and running my fingers over the impression of Max's paw. The idea of writing down our story felt both exciting and daunting. How could words capture the depth of what we had experienced together? How could language convey the miracle of two different species learning to speak the same heart language? But as I looked around at the party, at all the people who had been touched by our story in different ways, I understood that my mother was right. This wasn't just our story anymore. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt different or isolated, anyone who had ever doubted their worth or their ability to connect with others. That night, after all the guests had gone home and Max and I were settled in my room, I opened the journal and wrote the first entry. "My name is Sarah, and I want to tell you about the day I learned that love is the loudest sound in the world, even when you can't hear it with your ears." Over the summer, I filled page after page of that journal, writing about every detail I could remember from our journey together. I wrote about the storm and the construction site, about the fear and desperation in Max's eyes when I first found him. I wrote about learning to communicate without words, about the gradual building of trust and understanding between us. I wrote about the day my hearing returned, about the overwhelming joy and confusion of suddenly living in a world full of sound. I wrote about the way Max's voice sounded when I heard it for the first time, about the music and laughter and conversation that had been invisible to me for so long. But most of all, I wrote about love, the kind of love that doesn't need words to be real, that doesn't need sound to be heard, that doesn't need perfect circumstances to flourish. The kind of love that can transform a broken, abandoned dog into a confident, joyful companion. The kind of love that can awaken sleeping parts of the brain and create miracles that science can measure, but not fully explain. As I wrote, Max would lie beside my desk, sometimes sleeping, sometimes watching me with those deep brown eyes that held so much wisdom and understanding. Occasionally, he would rest his head on my foot or gently place his paw on my leg, as if to remind me that he was still there, still part of every word I wrote. The journal became more than just a record of our story. It became a meditation on the nature of communication, connection, and love. I found myself exploring questions that had never occurred to me before. What does it mean to truly understand another being? How do we bridge the gaps between different ways of experiencing the world? What happens when love becomes stronger than the barriers that should separate us? Writing also helped me process some of the more difficult aspects of our journey. I wrote about the guilt I sometimes felt for not having found Max sooner, for letting him suffer alone in that storm before I arrived. I wrote about the fear that my hearing might disappear as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving me bereft not just of sound, but of the proof that our love had been powerful enough to work miracles. I wrote about the pressure I sometimes felt to be grateful every moment of every day, as if having experienced a miracle meant I wasn't allowed to have normal childhood complaints or frustrations. I wrote about the way some people looked at me now, not with pity, as they had when I was deaf, but with a kind of reverent curiosity that made me feel like a specimen rather than a person. But most of all, I wrote about the profound sense of purpose that had grown from our experience. I was no longer just a little girl who happened to be deaf, and then happened to regain her hearing. I was someone who had learned something important about the world, something that other people needed to hear. I began to understand that Max and I had been given our story not just for our own benefit, but as a gift to offer others. Every person who heard about our journey and felt hope, every child who realized that being different didn't mean being broken, every family who opened their hearts to a rescue animal. They were all part of the larger story that had begun with two unlikely souls finding each other in a storm. By the time summer ended and I prepared to start 4th grade, I had filled nearly half the journal. My writing had improved dramatically through constant practice, and my teachers were amazed by the sophistication and emotional depth of my stories and essays. But more importantly, the act of writing had helped me understand my own story more clearly. I could see the patterns and connections that I had missed while living through the experiences. I could understand how each challenge had prepared me for the next phase of growth, how each moment of fear or uncertainty had led to greater strength and wisdom. Starting 4th grade with hearing was a completely different experience from anything I had known before. For the first time, I could participate fully in classroom discussions, hear the teacher's instructions clearly, and engage with my classmates in ways that had never been possible. But I also discovered that having hearing brought new challenges. I was suddenly aware of all the casual cruelty that children could inflict with words, the whispered comments and thoughtless jokes that I had been protected from during my silent years. I heard classmates making fun of other children who were different, using words as weapons in ways that made my heart ache. This newfound awareness of how words could hurt led to what my parents later called my advocacy phase. I became fiercely protective of any child who was being bullied or marginalized, using my voice, both literally and figuratively, to speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. My teachers were initially surprised by this more assertive version of me, but they quickly learned to channel my passion for justice into positive directions. I started a club for children with differences of all kinds. Kids who wore glasses, kids who had learning disabilities, kids who were shy or anxious or simply didn't fit into traditional social groups. Max became the unofficial mascot of our club, visiting the classroom regularly and helping shy children build confidence through interacting with him. There was something magical about watching a nervous, withdrawn child light up when Max gently rested his head in their lap or performed a trick just for them. Through these experiences, I began to understand that our story was part of a much larger narrative about acceptance, inclusion, and the power of love to transform lives. Max and I weren't just an isolated miracle. We were part of a movement toward understanding that differences should be celebrated rather than hidden, that communication takes many forms, and that the most important connections happen heart to heart rather than through conventional channels. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to change, Max and I celebrated the first anniversary of the day I found him in the construction site. My parents suggested we visit the site, which had finally been cleaned up and converted into a small park with walking trails and benches. Standing in the place where our story began, looking at the peaceful gardens and playground equipment that now occupied the space where I had once dragged an injured dog through the rain, I felt a profound sense of completion and gratitude. The concrete barriers were gone, replaced by gentle curves of landscaped walkways. The rushing water that had nearly drowned Max had been channeled into a decorative stream that babbled peacefully through the center of the park. Children played on swings and slides where debris and danger had once threatened anyone brave enough to venture into the abandoned space. But what moved me most was the small plaque that had been installed near the entrance to the park. It read, "Dedicated to the healing power of love and the courage to help those in need." Below the inscription was an image of a child's hand reaching toward a dog's paw. My parents later told me that they had worked with the city council to have the plaque installed, wanting to commemorate not just our story, but the broader message it represented. They had also established a small fund to help families adopt rescue animals, ensuring that other children might have the chance to experience the kind of transformative love that Max and I had found together. As we walked through the park that day, Max trotting beside me with his tail wagging, I reflected on how much had changed since that stormy October morning when desperation and hope had brought us together. The scared, injured dog who had once struggled against the rushing water was now a confident, beloved member of our family and community. The lonely little girl who had felt cut off from the world had become an advocate and storyteller, using her unique experiences to help others find their own paths to connection and understanding. But perhaps the most important change was the simplest one. I had learned that I was never really alone, even in my silence, because love speaks in every language, including the ones that can only be heard with the heart. Years have passed since that day in the construction site when I first found Max broken and afraid in the rushing water. He's older now, with gray around his muzzle and a slower gait that speaks of a life well lived and deeply loved. But those eyes, those deep brown eyes that first spoke to me in a language that transcended words, are still as bright and understanding as ever. Sometimes, when I'm having a difficult day or when the world feels too complicated and overwhelming, I look at Max and remember that moment when we first found each other. Two creatures who shouldn't have been able to communicate, who had every reason to give up and let the storm win, who chose instead to trust each other and fight for something better. We saved each other that day, Max and I. He saved me from a lifetime of feeling like I was broken or incomplete, and I saved him from dying alone and forgotten in the storm. But more than that, we saved each other from the lie that differences make us less than whole. The truth is, we were never broken. We were never incomplete. We were simply different. And different can be the most beautiful thing in the world when it's met with love and understanding. Max taught me that love doesn't need words to be real, that understanding doesn't need sound to be profound, and that the most important conversations happen in the spaces between heartbeats, where souls recognize each other across every barrier that should have kept them apart. He taught me that kindness is the most powerful force in the universe, that rescue can happen in both directions at once, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest challenges. But most of all, Max taught me that I was never alone, even in my silence, because love speaks in every language, including the ones that can only be heard with the heart. Today, as I write the final pages of this story, Max is sleeping in his favorite spot by the window, where the afternoon sun warms his graying fur and he can keep one eye on the world outside. His breathing is steady and peaceful, and occasionally, his legs twitch as he dreams of whatever adventures old dogs dream about. I can hear him breathing, thanks to the miracle he helped create. But I could understand him perfectly even if I couldn't, because some connections run deeper than sound. Some love is louder than words, and some friendships are strong enough to wake up sleeping parts of the soul. Max and I found each other in a storm, but we created something beautiful together in the calm that followed. We learned that communication is about so much more than the words we speak or the sounds we make. It's about the willingness to understand, the patience to listen with more than our ears, and the courage to love without conditions. And in the end, that's the most important lesson of all. That love is the universal language, and when it's spoken with a pure heart, it can overcome any barrier, heal any wound, and create miracles that doctors can't explain but hearts can understand. Max saved me, and I saved him. But maybe that's how all the best love stories work. Not with one person rescuing another, but with two souls choosing to rescue each other every single day, with small acts of kindness and understanding that add up to something larger than either of them could have created alone. The storm that brought us together has long since passed, but the love that grew from that storm continues to shine. A beacon of hope for anyone who has ever felt different, broken, or alone. Because the truth is, we're all just looking for someone who will love us exactly as we are, who will speak our secret language, and who will stay with us through whatever storms may come. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that someone has 4 legs, a tail that never stops wagging, and eyes that hold all the love and understanding in the world.